I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrington, but you're not authorized on this account, the bank officer said, sliding the property records across her desk. The deed was transferred solely to your husband's name 6 months ago. I stared at the document, my surgical nurse's hands perfectly steady despite the earthquake happening inside me. After 14 years of marriage, emptying my retirement account for James's first failed startup, and using my inheritance for our home's down payment, my tech entrepreneur husband had erased me from our property, just as his company hit a $50 million valuation. Through my attorney's glass wall, I watched James arrive, Tesla keys dangling from manicured fingers, his rehearsed concerned expression not matching the calculating eyes I'd somehow never truly seen before. His text glowed. On my phone, "Just a temporary legal strategy, trust me." I slipped the records into my purse and typed back, "See you at dinner, honey," with a smile emoji. The last thing he'd ever see from the trusting wife he thought he knew. What James failed to understand was that the same precision and strategic thinking that made me exceptional in the operating room would now be methodically applied to dismantling his entire life. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. When people meet me, Rebecca Chen, they see a dedicated surgical nurse, calm, in crisis, meticulous with details, and trained to anticipate complications before they become catastrophic. What they don't immediately recognize is that these same qualities make me exceptionally dangerous when betrayed. I met James Harrington during my second year at Valley Memorial Hospital. He was rushed into the ER after a cycling accident, 6 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a determination to check his emails even while hooked to an oxygen tank. I was assigned to his recovery, managing his pain medication and, increasingly, keeping his startup team from overwhelming him during healing. "You're different from the other nurses," he said on his third day. "You actually understand what I'm building." I did understand. My father had been a software engineer before cancer took him when I was 19, leaving me to support my mother through nursing school. I'd grown up surrounded by coding books and startup dreams. James's vision for healthcare management software resonated with my daily frustrations with hospital administration. By his discharge, we were already falling for each other. 6 months later, we were inseparable. James was brilliant, driven, and passionate about creating technology that would transform patient care coordination. His first company had failed, a necessary learning experience, he called it, but he was certain his new concept would revolutionize the industry. We married after dating for 18 months, a small ceremony with close friends and my mother, who was already showing early signs of dementia. I was 28, James was 32, and we rented a modest apartment where he coded late into the night while I worked rotating shifts at the hospital. Money was perpetually tight. My nursing salary covered our living expenses while every spare dollar went into James's company. I believed in his vision completely. When HealthSync succeeds, we succeed, became our mantra. There was no his money or my money, just our shared investment in the future. 3 years into our marriage, James's company secured its first small investment round, $300,000 from an angel investor who saw potential in the prototype. We celebrated with champagne in plastic cups, sitting on the floor of our apartment because we'd sold our furniture to extend our runway 2 months earlier. "This is just the beginning," James promised, his eyes bright with vindication after 3 years of rejections. "From here, we scale." The investment allowed James to hire 2 junior developers and move operations from our living room to a small office space. I continued working at the hospital, now taking extra shifts to compensate for the fact that James had stopped taking a salary to extend the company's cash flow. "Just until the next funding round," he assured me. "Then we'll be stable." When my mother's condition worsened, I moved to night shifts so I could accompany her to medical appointments during the day. James was supportive in theory, but increasingly absent in practice, consumed by pitch meetings and development deadlines. I managed her care alone, eventually moving her into our apartment when she could no longer safely live independently. The strain tested our marriage. James began sleeping at the office most nights, claiming the coding team worked best during late-night sessions. I was too exhausted from juggling patient care, my mother's needs, and our household to question this arrangement deeply. "I'm doing this for us," he reminded me whenever I expressed frustration. "For our future." Then came the devastating setback. The angel investor pulled out after the prototype encountered significant technical challenges. James was suddenly without funding, with 3 employees depending on him and a product that needed substantial reworking. That night, he came home, truly home, for the first time in months. I found him sitting in darkness in our living room at 3 a.m. when I returned from my shift. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. 3 years of work, and it's finished." I sat beside him, still in my scrubs, and made a decision that would shape the next decade of our lives. I withdrew $87,000 from my retirement account, accepting the penalties and taxes, and handed it to my husband. "It's not over. This buys you 6 more months to fix the problems and find new investors." James looked at me with a mixture of shock, gratitude, and something else I couldn't identify at the time. In retrospect, I recognize it as calculation. "You'd do that? Risk your security?" "It's our security," I corrected him. "Our dream." With renewed funding, James rebuilt the core technology. 6 months stretched to 18. But eventually, HealthSync secured a proper seed round of $1.2 million. The company expanded to 8 employees. James became CEO with a modest salary that allowed him to contribute to our household expenses again. As the company stabilized, we began discussing buying a home. After years in our cramped apartment, made more crowded by my mother's presence, we both yearned for space. It was during this house-hunting period that my mother passed away after a sudden decline. The grief was overwhelming, but practical matters demanded attention. My mother had owned a small home in her native Taiwan, which she'd rented out since moving to America 30 years earlier. As her only child, I inherited the property. We sold it for approximately $320,000, a sum that transformed our house. Hunt. "With this as a down payment, we can afford something truly suitable," James observed as we updated our search parameters. We found our home 2 weeks later, a beautiful craftsman in a desirable neighborhood close to both the hospital and James's office. The asking price was $895,000, steep for our income level, but with my inheritance as a substantial down payment, the mortgage would be manageable on our combined salaries. I remember the day we signed the paperwork vividly. James had insisted on using an attorney from his professional network rather than the one recommended by our real estate agent. "Business relationships matter," he'd explained. "Curtis has handled legal work for several successful startups. He understands our situation." Curtis Whitman was polished and efficient, guiding us through the closing process with minimal explanation. When I questioned a clause about property rights, he assured me it was standard language for our state. "Both your names are on the deed," he confirmed, sliding the document toward us for signatures. Equal ownership. I signed where indicated, trusting both my husband and his carefully selected attorney. The house became ours, or so I thought. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The next 5 years were a period of growth. James's company secured a Series A funding round of $8 million. Then 18 months later, a Series B of $22 million. HealthSync grew to over 60 employees, and James's leadership was praised in industry publications. I continued at the hospital, now as a senior surgical nurse specializing in cardiac procedures, but reduced my shifts to standard full-time hours, rather than the punishing overtime I'd worked for years. Our financial situation improved dramatically. We renovated the house, invested in retirement accounts to replace what I'd withdrawn, and even took actual vacations. James's salary increased with each funding round, eventually surpassing my nursing income many times over. Though my hospital work provided our health insurance and a stability his entrepreneurial path couldn't guarantee. "You never have to worry about money again," James told me after the Series B announcement. "Your faith in me paid off." I noticed subtle changes as the company grew. James began mentioning my company rather than our dream. His network became increasingly exclusive. Private clubs, investor dinners, tech conferences where spouses weren't invited. He upgraded his wardrobe, his watch collection, his car, all markers of his new status in the tech ecosystem. "Image matters in this industry," he explained when I questioned the $90,000 Tesla. "Investors expect a certain presentation." I remained largely unchanged, practical, focused on my patients, content with our increasingly comfortable but not extravagant lifestyle. The money mattered less to me than the security it represented after years of sacrifice. 2 years ago, HealthSync began preparing for its biggest move yet, a Series C funding round aimed at positioning the company for an eventual IPO. James became more distant, often traveling to meet potential investors or working late with his executive team. I saw him perhaps 10 hours a week, usually when he returned home after midnight or during brief Sunday brunches before he returned to the office. "This is the critical phase," he'd remind me whenever I expressed concern about his absence. "Everything we've worked for depends on this execution." I believed him. I'd always believed him. The first concrete sign of trouble came last year during tax preparation. I noticed James had created a separate account I wasn't aware of. Not unusual for a CEO with complex compensation, but his defensiveness when I inquired raised internal alarms. "It's just the company stock option plan," he said dismissively. "Too complicated to explain right now." Then came changes to our home. James insisted on renovations I hadn't requested: a completely redesigned kitchen, an expanded primary suite, a home office with separate entrance. All improvements that increased the property value substantially. "We can afford it now," he said when I questioned the timing. "And I need a proper workspace for when I take calls at home." The renovations required refinancing our mortgage. James handled the paperwork as he'd increasingly taken control of our financial management. "You're busy saving lives," he would say. "Let me worry about the tedious details." During this period, James suggested I sign a power of attorney just in case something happens while I'm traveling internationally for investor meetings. The document was presented among a stack of insurance forms and medical directives. Normal. Preparations for international travel. I signed without close examination, trusting my husband of 13 years. 6 months ago, HealthSync secured its Series C funding, $75 million at a valuation that made James's equity worth approximately $50 million on paper. The celebration dinner included his executive team and board members, but not me. I was covering an emergency shift for a colleague. James deposited $250,000 into our joint account the following day. "A small advance on our future," the transfer description read. I was touched by the gesture and used a portion to fund a cardiac care initiative at the hospital that I'd been passionate about developing. Everything seemed to be following the trajectory we'd sacrificed for, until 3 days ago, when I arrived at the bank to finalize the equity line of credit we'd discussed using for investments. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrington, but you're not authorized on this account," the loan officer said, frowning at her computer screen. "There must be a mistake. It's our home equity line, secured by our primary residence." Her discomfort was visible. As she carefully explained, "According to our records, the property is solely in James Harrington's name. It has been for approximately 6 months." The world tilted beneath me. "That's impossible. I'm on the deed. I paid the down payment." "I can only tell you what's in our system," she said gently. Perhaps your husband made changes during the refinancing. I left the bank in a daze, driving directly to the county recorder's office. Public records confirmed what the bank had claimed 6 months ago, coinciding exactly with the Series C funding announcement. James had used the power of attorney to remove my name from our home's deed, transferring full ownership to himself. That led me to today, standing in my attorney's office with irrefutable evidence of my husband's betrayal. Andrea Gibson was not just any attorney. She was the sister of a patient whose life I'd helped save during a complicated valve replacement. When I called her in panic yesterday, she immediately cleared her schedule. "This is clearly fraudulent," Andrea said now, her voice low and controlled as we watched James and his attorney through the glass. "The power of attorney you signed didn't authorize property transfers, and even if it had, using it this way would constitute breach of fiduciary duty." "What's his possible justification?" I asked, still struggling to reconcile the man I'd supported for 14 years with this calculated betrayal. "Most likely, he's preparing for the IPO by shielding assets. It's not uncommon for founders to restructure holdings before going public, but it's typically done with spousal knowledge and consent, not through deception." Andrea's paralegal entered with a folder of additional documents. "The search results you requested," she said quietly. I watched as Andrea reviewed them, her expression growing grimmer with each page. "Rebecca," she said finally, "there's more. 3 new LLCs formed in the past year, all controlled by James. Your joint investment account was liquidated 4 months ago, with assets transferred to one of these entities. And there's a recently purchased condominium downtown, $1.6 million paid in cash through another LLC. The confirmation of my worst fears should have devastated me. Instead, a strange clarity descended, the same focused precision I relied on during complex surgeries when complications arose. Time seemed to slow as my mind processed options, outcomes, contingencies. "He has no idea I've discovered this," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Andrea assessed me carefully. "That gives us a significant tactical advantage." What would happen if I confronted him right now? He'd control the narrative, claim it was a misunderstanding, a temporary arrangement for company purposes, or worse, convince you to sign additional documents that further compromise your position. I nodded. Decision. Crystallizing. "Then we haven't confronted him yet. We will prepare first." Andrea's expression shifted from concern to professional calculation. "What exactly do you want to accomplish here, Rebecca?" I considered the question as James checked his watch impatiently in the waiting area. This man had taken my retirement, savings when his first company failed. He'd accepted my inheritance for our home's down payment. He'd benefited from my stable income during years of entrepreneurial uncertainty. I'd believed we were building something together, a partnership with shared sacrifices toward shared rewards. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was a fundamental rejection of everything our relationship had supposedly represented. "What's legally mine?" I said finally, meeting Andrea's gaze. "And then I want him to lose everything else." Andrea nodded once, decision made. "Then let's proceed differently. I'll meet with them alone first. Maintain the pretense that you're still gathering documents. Meanwhile, you'll need a forensic accountant, electronic surveillance of your home and devices, and secure communications he can't access." "I can arrange all that today," I said, my nurse's efficiency taking over. "Good. And Rebecca?" Andrea's voice softened slightly. "Where will you stay tonight?" I hadn't considered that I couldn't return home, not if I wanted to maintain the element of surprise. My hospital colleague Sophie had a guest room. She'd watched me support James for years. She would understand without requiring complete explanations. "I have somewhere safe," I assured Andrea. She nodded, gathering her materials. "I'll tell them you're running late due to a hospital emergency. Use the back exit. And, Rebecca? From this moment forward, assume everything. Your phone, email, home, car is compromised. James has resources and clearly isn't the man you thought he knew. As I slipped out the rear door of the law office, a text arrived from James. Where are you? Attorney's time isn't cheap. I stared at the message. 14 years of marriage distilled into concerns about billable hours rather than my unexpected absence. My fingers hovered over the screen before typing a response crafted to buy time and maintain his false security. Emergency at hospital. Patient coding. Can't make it. So sorry. His reply came seconds later. Disappointing. We'll reschedule. Dinner at Maison tonight to make up for it? My treat. The casual normality of his invitation, as if he hadn't systematically betrayed me, crystallized my resolve. James believed he was dealing with the same supportive, trusting wife who had sacrificed everything for his dreams. He was about to discover his most catastrophic miscalculation. Sounds perfect, I replied. Looking forward to it. Then I turned off location services on my phone, called Sophie to arrange emergency housing, and began making a list of everything I would need for what came next. James had declared war without realizing it. I was now methodically preparing to end it, decisively and completely. Sophie's guest room became my war room. After explaining the bare minimum, James and I are having serious problems. I need somewhere to stay discreetly. She gave me space, asking no further questions. Her loyalty wasn't surprising. She'd witnessed my dedication to James for years, covering my shifts during his company crises, listening to my concerns during his absences. Stay as long as you need, she said, handing me a spare key. I'm on. Night shifts this week anyway. Perfect. I needed privacy and time. First, I needed secure communications. I purchased a prepaid phone with cash at a convenience store 6 miles from Sophie's apartment, then drove to an electronics store in a different neighborhood to buy a laptop that couldn't be traced to me. Operating on surgical instinct, I kept thinking, maintain sterile field, prevent contamination, control the environment. By 3 p.m., I had established my base. I created new email accounts using the laptop's private browsing mode and connected only through public Wi-Fi at a library 2 neighborhoods away. I transferred $8,000 from my personal checking account to a newly opened account at a credit union where James would never think to look. Not enough to trigger automatic reporting, but sufficient for immediate needs. Andrea had given me a list of recommended specialists. My first call was to Derek Menendez, a forensic accountant who specialized in high-net-worth divorces and financial fraud. I can start immediately, he said after I explained my situation. But I'll need access to as many financial records as you can provide: banking statements, tax returns, property documents, anything connected to your husband's business interests. I have some digital records, but most documentation is at our house. I can't return there without alerting him. Not unusual in these situations, Derek assured me. We'll work with what you have initially and strategize about obtaining the day. Rest. Can you meet tomorrow morning? We arranged a meeting at Andrea's office for 8 a.m. I spent the next hour uploading every financial document I could access remotely to a secure cloud folder Derek provided. My next call was to Mira Patel and Da'ain, electronic security specialist Andrea had described as the person who catches tech CEOs hiding assets from their spouses. Her initial questions were direct and technical. Does your husband have access to your devices? Email accounts? Cloud storage? Yes to all 3, I admitted. We've shared passwords for years. Then we assume all your regular communications are compromised, she said matter-of-factly. Your husband runs a tech company. He has resources and knowledge most spouses don't. We need to assume sophisticated surveillance. Even at our house? Especially at your house. Smart home systems, security cameras, even digital assistants, all potential monitoring points. Do not discuss strategy on any device or in any location that could be compromised. She recommended specific security measures, which apps to avoid, how to communicate with my team, which locations to consider safe zones for meetings. We arranged for her to conduct a thorough digital security assessment the following day. By 5 p.m., I had established a secure foundation. Now came the strategic component. I needed to appear normal to James while gathering evidence and building my case. Tonight's dinner would be my first test, maintaining the appearance of the trusting wife while sitting across from the man who had betrayed me. I showered and changed into clothes I'd hastily packed, a blue dress James had always liked, appropriate for Maison, the upscale restaurant he'd chosen. As I applied makeup with practiced precision, I considered my approach. In the operating room, we're taught to anticipate complications before they arise. The same principle applied here. James would expect questions about the missed meeting. He'd have prepared answers, justifications designed to maintain my compliance. I needed to appear accepting without actually accepting anything that might compromise my position. At 6:30, I texted him from my regular phone. On my way, traffic heavy, might be 5 min late. His response came immediately. No problem. Got our usual table. Our usual table. The corner booth where we'd celebrated each of his funding announcements, where he'd given me a sapphire necklace after the Series B round, the table that represented our shared journey. I parked 2 blocks from the restaurant, using those minutes to center myself. In surgery, emotional control isn't optional, it's essential. Lives depend on maintaining composure regardless of unexpected complications. Tonight required the same discipline. James was already seated when I arrived, studying his phone with the intense focus I once found endearing. He stood when he saw me, his smile practiced but convincing. If I hadn't seen the property documents, I might have believed his affection was genuine. There she is, he said, kissing my cheek. Saving lives and keeping me waiting. Some things never change. I returned his smile with measured warmth, not too effusive, not too distant. Sorry about the meeting? Pediatric emergency? Don't apologize for doing what you do best, he said, ever magnanimous when it cost him nothing. We can reschedule. Curtis understands. Curtis. His attorney who had facilitated removing my name from our home's deed. I maintained my expression, while imagining Curtis explaining his role in this deception to the State Bar Association. What was the meeting about anyway? I asked, keeping my tone casual as I studied the menu I'd memorized years ago. James's answer was predictably vague. Just some estate planning adjustments. Technical legal stuff to protect our assets as the company grows. Nothing urgent. Estate planning. A clever euphemism for systematically removing my name from our property. I trust you to handle it, I said, the words bitter on my tongue. You've always been better with those details. His pleased expression confirmed I'd struck the right note. James enjoyed being perceived as the strategic thinker, the protector, despite the fact that my financial discipline had kept us afloat during his company's struggling years. Speaking of the company, he continued, the IPO timeline has accelerated. The board wants to file within 6 months. This was significant information. IPOs required extensive disclosure and scrutiny. If James was hiding assets or restructuring property to my disadvantage, he was operating under time pressure. This explained the accelerated timeline of his betrayal. That's wonderful, I said, reaching for his hand across the table. Everything you've worked for is happening. The you, instead of we, was deliberate. I wanted to observe whether he'd correct me, acknowledge my contribution to his success. He didn't. It's been a long road, he said instead, but we're finally reaching the destination. Dinner proceeded. With superficial conversation, his latest board meeting, my recent difficult surgery, plans for renovating the garden that I now knew I legally had no claim to. I maintained the performance, asking questions at appropriate moments, laughing at his industry anecdotes, playing the role of supportive wife while mentally cataloging everything that could be useful later. When dessert arrived, James reached into his jacket pocket. "I have something for you?" He placed a small jewelry box on the table. Inside was a diamond tennis bracelet, elegant and expensive. "What's this for?" I asked, genuinely surprised. Gifts had become rare as our marriage progressed. "Do I need a reason to appreciate my wife?" he said, smiling. "Plus, I thought you might want something nice for the investor gala next month." The bracelet suddenly made sense. The investor gala was a high-profile event where James would showcase not just his company, but his personal brand. Successful CEO, visionary leader, family man with the supportive, attractive wife. The bracelet wasn't a gift, it was a costume. Piece for the role he needed me to play. "It's beautiful," I said, allowing him to fasten it around my wrist. "Thank you." By the time we left the restaurant, I had gathered valuable intelligence. James believed his deception was still undetected. He expected me to continue in my supporting role through the IPO process. He hadn't mentioned the property transfer, the liquidated investment account, or the downtown condominium. Most importantly, he clearly didn't see me as a threat. After declining his suggestion that we share a ride home, "I need to stop by the hospital to check on my patient," I kissed him goodnight with just the right amount of affection, neither arousing suspicion nor promising intimacy. Back in my car, I immediately removed the bracelet and placed it in an evidence bag I'd brought from the hospital. Every gift, every communication, every financial transaction now needed to be documented. The diamond bracelet wasn't just jewelry. It was evidence of James attempting to maintain my compliance through financial manipulation. At Sophie's apartment, I found 3 emails waiting in my new secure account. One from Andrea confirming our 8 a.m. meeting, one from Derek outlining initial findings from the financial documents I'd provided, and one from Mira with a secure communication protocol for our team. Derek's preliminary analysis was concerning. Initial review indicates systematic movement of joint assets to single control, entities beginning approximately 18 months ago. Pattern suggests careful preparation rather than opportunistic actions. We'll have more details tomorrow. 18 months. The betrayal had been in progress since before HealthSync's Series C funding. While I was supporting James's dream, working hospital shifts, attending his company functions, he had been methodically preparing to cut me out of our shared success. I spent 3 hours documenting everything I could remember about our finances, accounts I knew existed, properties, investments, valuable possessions in our home, vehicles. I created a timeline of major financial events in our marriage, my retirement account withdrawal, my inheritance, home purchase, renovations, significant gifts. By 2 a.m., exhaustion overtook me, but I had established a foundation for tomorrow's meetings. I set my alarm for 6 a.m., knowing I needed to arrive at Andrea's office early to review strategy before our team assembled. As I finally lay down in Sophie's guest room, I realized I hadn't cried. Not at the bank when I discovered the property transfer. Not in Andrea's office when I learned about the condominium. Not during dinner watching James's performance of devoted husband. The emotion would come later, I knew from experience with trauma patients. For now, the clinical detachment that made me effective in emergency medicine was serving a different purpose. James had made a critical miscalculation. He saw only the supportive, compliant wife I'd been for 14 years. He didn't recognize that the same qualities that made me an exceptional nurse, precise assessment, strategic thinking, calm under pressure, attention to detail, would make me a formidable adversary. Tomorrow would begin the next phase, gathering evidence, securing assets, building the case that would not just reclaim what was rightfully mine, but ensure James Harrington understood the true cost of betrayal. I closed my eyes, not to dream, but to rest. The surgical strike I was planning required precision timing, perfect execution, and absolutely no margin for error. Morning arrived after a fitful sleep. I was showered and dressed by 6:30 a.m., wearing a tailored suit I'd thankfully kept at the hospital for board meetings, professional armor for the battle ahead. Andrea's office was already humming with activity when I arrived at 7:45. She had commandeered the largest conference room, its glass walls now covered with privacy film. A digital security scanner swept the room twice daily for surveillance devices, standard procedure for high-stakes divorce cases involving wealthy clients. "You look remarkably composed for someone whose life imploded 48 hours ago," Andrea observed, handing me coffee in a ceramic mug. "Professional hazard," I replied. "In the OR, showing stress kills patients. I've had years of practice keeping it together." "That discipline will serve you well here," she said, gesturing to the conference table where 3 laptops were arranged. "We've assembled your team. Derek is already reviewing the financial data you provided. Mira will join us at 9 to discuss digital security. I've also brought in someone with expertise in startup valuations, critical for assessing what James's company shares are actually worth." Derek Menendez entered carrying a leather portfolio. In his mid-50s with salt and pepper hair and rimless glasses, he had the focused demeanor of someone who found satisfaction in tracking numerical discrepancies. "Mrs. Harrington," he said, extending his hand. "I've reviewed your preliminary documents. We have work to do." For the next hour, Derek walked us through what he'd discovered from the limited financial information I'd been able to provide. The picture was concerning but incomplete. James had been systematically restructuring our assets since Health Sync's Series B funding round, creating a complex network of LLCs and trusts. Most troubling was the pattern of moving jointly held investments into entities I had no access to. "Based on what I'm seeing, there's approximately $1.2 million in assets that were jointly owned and have been transferred into these new structures," Derek explained, indicating a diagram he'd created showing the money flow. "Not including the house or his company equity." "And that's just what we can track with the limited documents we have," Andrea added. "We need the complete financial picture." "Which means I need to return home," I said, stating the inevitable conclusion. "To gather documents." Andrea nodded. "Strategically, yes, but not without preparation and protection." At 9 o'clock, Mira Patel arrived. Where Derek was methodical and measured, Mira crackled with focused energy. In her early 30s with a geometric haircut and multiple piercings along one ear, she looked more like a tech startup employee than a security consultant, which was precisely her advantage in her work. "First thing," she said without preamble, placing a small device on the conference table. "This is a signal jammer. It creates a secure bubble around us. No electronic eavesdropping possible while it's active." She pushed a sleek phone across the table toward me. "Your new secure device. Encrypted, untraceable to you. Use it only for communicating with this team. Your regular phone is now for show. Only use it to maintain appearances with James, but assume everything on it is compromised." Over the next hour, Mira outlined the digital security landscape I was facing. James, as CEO of a health technology company, had sophisticated resources at his disposal. His home office likely had advanced security systems, possibly with monitoring capabilities. Our home automation system, controlling everything from thermostats to door locks, could potentially track movements in the house. "Can you disable these systems remotely?" I asked. "Some, yes. Others would require physical access. The key is to make any necessary moves look like normal system fluctuations, not deliberate tampering." She pulled up a diagram of our home's network architecture, which she'd mapped remotely overnight. "Your husband has implemented enterprise-grade security. Not surprising for a health tech CEO handling sensitive data." By 10 o'clock, we had moved from assessment to strategy. Andrea led the discussion, pulling together the financial and security considerations into a coherent plan. "We have 3 immediate objectives," she said, writing on a whiteboard. "First, secure documentary evidence of financial transactions and property ownership. Second, establish Rebecca's claim to marital assets before they're further diminished. Third, maintain the element of surprise while accomplishing the first two goals. The plan that emerged was methodical, designed to capitalize on James's underestimation of me. I would continue the appearance of normalcy while our team built the legal and financial case. This dual approach, visible compliance masking and visible resistance, suited my temperament perfectly. In surgery, we often maintain a calm external presence while urgently addressing internal crises. When do you typically work hospital shifts? Andrea asked. 3 12-hour shifts weekly, usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Perfect. Those are your information-gathering days. James will expect you to be unavailable, giving you freedom to meet with us. What about returning home? James expects me there tonight, Mira interjected. We need to sweep your personal devices and establish secure protocols first. I recommend staying elsewhere one more night with a plausible medical explanation. I nodded, already composing a text about a complicated patient case requiring overnight monitoring. James would accept this without question. My dedication to difficult cases was well established. By noon, we had developed a comprehensive strategy with specific assignments for each team member. Derek would continue tracing financial movements and documenting asset transfers. Mira would establish digital security protocols and prepare for a sweep of my devices. Andrea would begin preparing legal filings to be submitted at the optimal moment. My role was perhaps the most challenging, returned to my life with James as if nothing had changed, while methodically gathering evidence and securing my position. It required maintaining a convincing performance while executing a precise legal and financial strategy. Remember, Andrea cautioned as our meeting concluded, the element of surprise is our greatest advantage. Once James realizes you're taking action, he'll move quickly to protect himself. Everything we do must appear normal until we're ready to strike. I left Andrea's office with a secured folder of documents, my new encrypted phone, and a clear set of immediate tasks. First stop, the hospital, where my presence would be expected and completely normal. I needed to adjust my upcoming schedule, ensuring I had the necessary flexibility while maintaining appearances. The familiar environment of Valley Memorial Hospital provided momentary comfort. For 14 years, this had been my constant. While James's career fluctuated from failure to success, the hospital remained my professional anchor. Now it would serve as both cover and resource. Dr. Liu, my department head, was in his office reviewing charts when I knocked. "Rebecca, come in. How's your valve replacement patient from Tuesday?" "Recovering well," I replied automatically. "Listen, I need to adjust my schedule for the next few weeks. Personal matters." Dr. Liu and I had worked together for over a decade. He knew me well enough to recognize the seriousness beneath my composed exterior. "Everything all right?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. I hesitated, calculating how much to reveal. I needed flexibility without generating workplace gossip that might reach James through our overlapping professional circles. "James and I are working through some difficult issues," I said finally. "I may need irregular hours over the next few weeks." Dr. Liu nodded, asking no further questions. "Take whatever time you need. Your patients can be reassigned temporarily. Just keep me updated on your availability." "I'll still work my shifts," I assured him. "But I may need to leave promptly rather than staying for overages. And I might request some specific days." "Done," he said simply. This conversation accomplished multiple objectives. It explained any changes in my routine, established support within my professional environment, and created flexibility without raising suspicions. My next task was more delicate, retrieving essential items from our home without alerting James to my changed priorities. According to his shared calendar, he had meetings until 6 p.m. This gave me a window to access the house, secure critical documents, and establish Mira's security monitoring. I texted James from my regular phone. Coming home to shower and change before checking on the patient again tonight. Might be late. His reply came quickly. Dinner meeting with investors? We'll probably crash at office after. Deadlines. Perfect. His crashing at the office had once been a source of marital tension. Now it was a tactical advantage. Mira had given me specific instructions. Enter the house normally, act routinely, retrieve only what wouldn't be noticed missing, and place the monitoring devices she'd provided in specific locations. I was to avoid using home computers, speak normally as if unaware of any surveillance, and leave within an hour. Driving to our home, a trip I'd made thousands of times over 8 years, felt surreal. The Craftsman, with its welcoming front porch and meticulously maintained garden, had represented security, achievement, partnership. Now it symbolizes betrayal. I used my key to enter, calling out habitually, "Hello?" though I knew the house was empty. Moving with deliberate casualness, I checked the mail, hung my jacket in the closet, and proceeded upstairs as I would on any normal day. In our bedroom, I gathered essentials I would need while staying elsewhere. Additional clothing, toiletries, my medical reference books. Nothing that would immediately signal a prolonged absence. While selecting items from my closet, I casually placed one of Mira's monitoring devices, disguised as a phone charger, on my nightstand. The home office was more challenging. James spent significant time there, and any disturbance might be noticed. Following Mira's instructions, I entered with a plausible purpose, retrieving medical journals I kept on a bookshelf. While doing so, I carefully photographed visible documents on his desk using the specialized app Mira had installed on my secure phone. The filing cabinet presented another opportunity. Using the key from our shared household key drawer, I unlocked it and quickly photographed key financial documents. Property records, investment statements, insurance policies. Most critically, I located and photographed the power of attorney document I'd signed, essential evidence for proving the fraudulent property transfer. Throughout this process, I maintained normal movements, occasionally speaking aloud as if talking to myself about patient cases, cover in case of audio surveillance. Need to check those post-op notes. Remember to call the pharmacy about that dosage adjustment. In the kitchen, I placed another monitoring device disguised as a digital food thermometer in a drawer. Then I made a show of checking the refrigerator, noting aloud, "Need groceries," as if mentally preparing a shopping list. My final task was the most technically challenging. Following Mira's detailed instructions, I needed to connect a small device to our home network router, hidden in a decorative box in the living room, that would allow her limited access to monitor network traffic. This would reveal what information was leaving our house and to where. With practiced precision, the same steady hands that performed delicate vascular sutures, I connected the device while appearing to adjust the router after a fictional connectivity issue with my phone. To any observer, it would seem like routine troubleshooting. After 53 minutes in the house, I departed with a small overnight bag, essential documents photographed, and monitoring systems in place. As I pulled away, I texted James. Heading back to hospital. Patient developing complications. Will update. Later. His response was predictable. Don't work too hard, taking clients to Morton's tonight. I drove not to the hospital, but to a coffee shop 3 miles away, one of the safe zones Mira had identified for secure communications. From my encrypted phone, I messaged the team. Phase 1 complete, heading to a secondary location. The secondary location was a small extended-stay hotel where I'd checked in under my maiden name using cash. Mira had selected it for its minimal security cameras and location outside James's normal travel patterns. Here, I would meet with her to review what I'd gathered and plan next steps. Mira arrived at 5 p.m. carrying an unassuming laptop bag. After scanning the room for surveillance devices, she connected to a secure VPN and began downloading the photos I'd taken. Good work, she said, reviewing the images. The power of attorney document is particularly important. The language explicitly limits its scope to medical decisions and basic financial management during international travel. There's no authorization for property transfers. She turned to the monitoring feeds now coming from our house. The devices are functioning correctly. We're getting data from both your home network and the passive monitors. Now we wait to see what patterns emerge. What exactly are we looking for? I asked. Communication patterns, file transfers, unusual access times. If James is consulting with lawyers or financial advisors about asset movements, it might leave digital traces. More importantly, we need to establish if he's actively monitoring you, checking your location, accessing your communications, reviewing security footage. We spent the next hour establishing secure protocols for my continuing performance as an unsuspecting wife. Mira set up specialized applications on my secure phone that would alert me to potential surveillance, provided counter-surveillance hardware to detect if I was being followed physically, and established a communication schedule with the team. Remember, she said before leaving, from now on, assume everything you do in that house is being watched and recorded. Every conversation, every computer interaction, every routine activity. Act exactly as you would normally. That's essentially what I do in the OR, I noted. Perform complex procedures while appearing completely calm for the benefit of residents and staff. Exactly. This is a surgical procedure with your financial future as the patient. Precision and appearances matter equally. After Mira departed, I reviewed the day's developments. In just over 24 hours, I had assembled a specialized team, secured critical evidence, established monitoring systems, and positioned myself to gather more information while maintaining the illusion of normalcy. The infrastructure for my counteroffensive was now in place. I ordered room service, something I rarely did, a small luxury in this disorienting new reality, and reviewed the secure document folder Andrea had prepared. It contained legal explanations of marital property rights in our state, protocols for documenting financial transactions, and templates for the affidavits I would need to complete. As I ate a surprisingly good pasta primavera, my regular phone buzzed with a text from James. Meeting's running late. Definitely staying at the office tonight. Don't wait up, I replied with wifely concern. Don't work too hard. I'm monitoring my patient overnight at the hospital. Two people, both lying about their whereabouts, both believing they were controlling the narrative. The difference was that James didn't know he was being outmaneuvered. He still saw me as the supporting character in his success story, not recognizing I had begun writing a completely different ending. Before settling in for the night, I called Sophie from my secure phone to thank her for the emergency housing and explain I wouldn't be returning tonight. Are you safe? She asked, the only question that mattered to her. Completely safe, I assured her. Just navigating complicated waters. If you need anything at all, I'm here. No questions asked. Her unconditional support nearly cracked my careful composure. In the calculated chess match with James, I'd been focused on strategy rather than the emotional reality of what was happening. Sophie's simple offer of help reminded me that while I was methodically dismantling my marriage, I was also rebuilding a life. One where genuine support, not manipulation, would be the foundation. Thank you, I said, meaning it deeply. I'll be in touch soon. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and reviewed tomorrow's objectives. Return to Andrea's office to review the photographed documents, meet with the startup valuation expert to assess James's equity worth, and prepare for my scheduled hospital shift, which would provide perfect cover for these activities. As I finally lay down to sleep, I realized that today marked a fundamental shift. For 14 years, I had been supporting James's dreams, subordinating my needs to his ambitions, believing we were building something together. Today, I had taken the first concrete steps toward reclaiming my own story. The property deed he had so carefully altered was just the beginning. By removing my name, James thought he was securing his future. Instead, he had activated skills he'd never bothered to recognize in me: precision, strategy, and the absolute focus that made me exceptional in crisis situations. Tomorrow would bring the next phase, not just gathering information, but beginning to secure and reclaim assets. The surgical strike was proceeding exactly according to plan. The next morning unfolded according to plan. I arrived at the hospital for my 7 a.m. shift, performed a complex valve replacement with Dr. Liu, and managed post-operative care with my usual efficiency. No one observing me would have detected anything unusual. My hands remained steady, my clinical decisions precise, my interactions with colleagues normal. Only Sophie, bringing me coffee during a brief break, gave any indication. She knew something had changed. "You're okay?" she asked quietly, her eyes conveying deeper concern than her casual words. "Managing," I replied with a small smile. "Thanks for the coffee." At 2 p.m., I handed off to the incoming shift nurse with detailed patient notes and exited the hospital through the staff entrance. According to my regular routine, I would now be heading home for rest after a demanding shift. Instead, I drove to Andrea's office for our scheduled meeting. Derek Menendez was waiting in the conference room, his expression grimmer than during our previous meeting. The digital security screens now displayed multiple financial documents, some I recognized from my home office, others unfamiliar. "We've identified some concerning transactions," Derek began without preamble once the room was secured. "The photos you took of the financial documents have filled in several gaps in our understanding." He displayed a complex diagram showing money flows between various entities. "Your husband has created a sophisticated structure designed to shield assets. Based on what we've found, approximately $3.2 million in marital assets have been repositioned into vehicles solely under his control." The figure stunned me. "That's significantly more than your initial estimate." "The preliminary assessment was based on incomplete information," Derek explained. "The documents you photographed revealed additional accounts and transfers." Andrea entered the room, accompanied by a woman in her late 40s with short silver hair and penetrating eyes. "Rebecca, this is Valerie Winters, our startup valuation specialist. She's been analyzing HealthSync's financial position." Valerie nodded briskly. "Based on the Series C funding documents you photographed, your husband's equity stake is currently valued at approximately $48 million. However, there are significant restrictions and vesting schedules. Not all of that is immediately accessible or liquid. More concerning," she continued, "is evidence that he's been transferring portions of his equity to a trust structure you're not connected to. It appears to have been established about 14 months ago." Another betrayal, with roots reaching back even further than I'd imagined. I felt a cold anger crystallizing beneath my professional composure. "Show me everything," I said. For the next hour, Derek and Valerie presented their findings, documenting a pattern of systematic financial separation that had begun well before the property deed transfer. James had been methodically disconnecting our financial lives for over a year, coinciding with HealthSync's accelerating success. "What's particularly troubling," Derek noted, "is this pattern of cash withdrawals." He displayed a series of bank statements showing bi-weekly withdrawals of $9,000 from our joint business account, just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger automatic reporting to financial authorities. Over the past 8 months, these withdrawals total approximately $144,000. We've been unable to trace where this cash has gone. Andrea made a note. "Consistent removal of marital assets. The court will take a very dim view of this pattern." I was processing this information with clinical detachment when Mira burst into the conference room, her usual composed efficiency replaced by evident agitation. "We need to talk," she said, glancing at the others. "Privately." Andrea nodded to Derek and Valerie, who gathered their materials and stepped out. Once the door closed, Mira connected her laptop to the conference room display. The monitoring, Systems we placed in your home picked up something you need to see immediately, she said, pulling up a series of digital files. These are recordings from the network monitor attached to your router. At 11:42 this morning, while you were in surgery, James returned to your house with someone. She hesitated, unusual for her direct personality. You should prepare yourself. This isn't just financial betrayal. With a few keystrokes, she played an audio file captured by the kitchen monitoring device. I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening, followed by James's voice. We have at least 3 hours. Rebecca's in surgery until 2, then. She usually stops for coffee with colleagues. A woman's laugh, intimate and familiar. And you're sure the house isn't monitored? I control the security system, James replied confidently. No recording, no surveillance she can access. I had it reconfigured last month. What followed were unmistakable sounds of physical intimacy, moving from the kitchen to the living room, punctuated by conversation that made it clear this was not a first encounter. When are you finally going to tell her? The woman asked eventually. The IPO is in less than 6 months. We can't keep hiding forever. It's complicated, James replied. Rebecca's still useful for the company image, the dedicated nurse supporting the healthcare visionary. Investors eat that story up. Once we go public and the shares convert, there will be a better time for transition. And the house? Our place? Already taken care of, James said smugly. I removed her from the deed months ago. The downtown condo is in an LLC she knows nothing about. Post-IPO, we can live however we want. I sat perfectly still, my surgical composure maintaining despite the earthquake of revelations. The financial betrayal had been calculated enough. This added dimension, using me as a prop for his company image while planning his exit, crystallized the complete disregard with which James viewed our marriage. Mira looked at me cautiously. There's more. The woman is Natalie Reynolds. The name registered immediately. Natalie Reynolds, HealthSync's chief marketing officer, hired 18 months ago to position the company for its Series C funding and eventual IPO. A woman I'd met at company functions, who had smiled and engaged in pleasant conversation while apparently sleeping with my husband in our home. Financial records now make more sense, Mira continued. The downtown condominium purchased through the LLC, property records show it's 3 blocks from HealthSync's headquarters. And those cash withdrawals Derek identified? They align with deposits into an account Natalie opened 16 months ago. Andrea, who had been silent during this revelation, finally spoke. This changes our strategy. Infidelity with a company. Executive adds multiple dimensions. Potential breach of corporate governance, misuse of company resources, conflict of interest. The board of directors would be extremely concerned about this relationship potentially derailing the IPO. I nodded, mind already recalibrating our approach. How do we leverage this information? Very carefully, Andrea advised. This gives us significant additional leverage, but timing is critical. If we expose this relationship prematurely, James might accelerate his plans to discard you before the IPO. We need to secure your financial position first. We spent the next hour revising our strategy. The discovery of James's affair with a company executive created both risks and opportunities. On one hand, it explained the accelerated timeline of his financial maneuvers. On the other hand, it provided powerful leverage with both the divorce court and potentially HealthSync's board of directors. I recommend we expedite securing your financial position, Andrea advised. File emergency motions to freeze marital assets, document the fraudulent property transfer, and establish your claim to a portion of James's equity compensation. What about returning home? I asked. The thought of continuing the charade suddenly, more difficult, more important than ever, Andrea insisted. If James suspects you've discovered either the financial deception or the affair, he might take drastic measures. The element of surprise remains our greatest advantage. It was decided. I would return home that evening, maintaining the performance of the unsuspecting wife, while our legal team prepared emergency filings. We would move to secure assets within 72 hours, at which point the facade would become unnecessary. Before leaving Andrea's office, I received disturbing news from Mira's digital security monitoring. James accessed your email account remotely yesterday evening, and he's been tracking your location through your shared iCloud account. He knows where your phone has been at all times. Fortunately, I'd been exactly where I was supposed to be, at the hospital during my shift, then at Andrea's office, which my calendar listed as a medical conference location. The hotel where I'd actually spent the night was never registered on my regular phone's location services. He's monitoring you closely, Mira warned. Be exceptionally careful. I left Andrea's office with 2 phones, my regular device containing nothing suspicious and giving James the location data he expected, and my secure phone hidden in a specially designed compartment in my purse that blocked all signals until I needed to use it. The drive home required mental preparation. I needed to walk into my house knowing James had been there with another woman hours earlier, knowing he was systematically betraying me professionally and personally, and still maintain a convincing performance of normalcy. I stopped at the grocery store as I typically would after a shift, purchasing ingredients for dinner. Every action needed to align with established patterns. As I selected vegetables and checked expiration dates on yogurt containers, I mentally rehearsed the evening ahead. I would prepare dinner, discuss my day with appropriate medical anecdotes, inquire about James's meetings, and maintain the fiction of our partnership for just a little longer. When I arrived home, James's Tesla was already in the driveway, unusual for a Wednesday evening. Typically, he worked late after board meetings, which his shared calendar indicated was scheduled for today. I entered carrying grocery bags, calling out casually, "I'm home." James appeared from his home office, smiling firmly in place. "There. She is. How was the surgery?" "Successful," I replied, setting the groceries on the kitchen counter, the same counter where he and Natalie had been intimate hours earlier. Mitral valve replacement on a 62-year-old patient. Textbook procedure. "That's my brilliant wife," he said, kissing my cheek. The casual affection, knowing what I now knew, required every ounce of my professional composure to accept without reaction. "You're home early," I observed, beginning to unpack groceries. "I thought you had board meetings all day." "Finished early for once," he replied smoothly. "Thought I'd surprise you. Maybe we could have dinner together. Been a while. Since we've had a proper conversation." The deviation from routine immediately triggered my suspicion. James rarely altered his work schedule, particularly during this critical pre-IPO period. His sudden interest in proper conversation seemed calculated rather than spontaneous. "Sounds lovely," I said, maintaining my performance. I picked up ingredients for pasta primavera. As I prepared dinner, James opened wine and engaged in casual conversation, asking unusually specific questions about my hospital schedule, my recent communications with colleagues, and my upcoming plans. "Thinking about that cardiac conference in Chicago next month?" he asked, seemingly casual. "You mentioned it a while back. I hadn't mentioned any such conference, but I recognized the probe for what it was, testing whether I had plans to travel, perhaps suspecting I might be making exit arrangements. Still considering it," I replied vaguely. "Department budget is tight this quarter." Throughout dinner, I maintained appropriate conversation while mentally cataloging James's unusual behaviors, increased physical affection, detailed questions about my schedule and plans, references to our future together that contrasted sharply with what I'd heard him tell Natalie hours earlier. After dinner, as I loaded the dishwasher, James received a text that clearly displeased him, though he attempted to hide his reaction. "Everything okay?" I asked innocently. "Just work," he said dismissively. "Listen, I need to handle something for about an hour. Conference call with Singapore investors. Time zones, you know." "Of course," I replied. "I have patient charts to review anyway." Once James retreated to his office, closing the door, I activated the secure phone long enough to text Mira. "Jay acting unusual," monitoring suggested. Her response came minutes later. "Remote access to home security cameras activated from an unknown location 30 min ago. Assume visual surveillance in all common areas." Someone, likely Natalie, was watching the house remotely, perhaps to ensure I didn't display any knowledge of their relationship. The layers of surveillance and counter-surveillance had escalated dramatically. I continued my evening routine, reviewing medical journals in the living room while occasionally making notes, exactly as I would on any normal evening. When James emerged from his office, he suggested watching a show together, another deviation from recent patterns. "Actually, I'm exhausted," I said, feigning a yawn. "Might turn in early if you don't mind." "Of course," he replied, disappointment seemingly genuine. "You worked hard today. Rest well." In our bedroom, I went through my typical nighttime routine while using the bathroom fan to cover sending a secure message to Andrea. "James' behavior is unusual. Suspect acceleration of timeline. Advice." Her response came quickly. "Emergency. Filing prepared. Will submit at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Maintain a normal appearance until notified." That night, lying beside the husband who had betrayed me so completely, I maintained steady breathing patterns, suggesting sleep, while my mind processed the accelerating situation. James's unusual behavior suggested he might suspect something or be preparing additional moves against me. The timeline for countermeasures needed adjustment. In surgery, when a patient suddenly destabilizes, we don't panic, we adapt, making precise adjustments to the procedure while maintaining overall strategy. The same principle applied here. James's unexpected behavior represented a complication, but not one that would derail our carefully planned operation. Morning arrived after a night of minimal sleep. I rose at my usual time, prepared coffee, and mentioned casually to James that I had preoperative consultations beginning at 7:30 a.m. "Want to have dinner out tonight?" he suggested, another unusual overture. "That new place on Riverside you've been wanting to try? I'd love that," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Text me when you know your schedule." I left for the hospital exactly on time, my regular phone transmitting my location data precisely as expected. Once there, I changed into Scrubs and sent a secure message to our team. Proceeding with an accelerated timeline. At precisely 9 a.m., while I was consulting with a cardiac patient, Andrea filed emergency motions with the family court. A request to freeze all marital assets, restoration of my name to the property deed based on fraudulent transfer, and financial discovery requiring immediate disclosure of all accounts and holdings. By 10:30 a.m., the judge had signed the emergency orders. By 11 a.m., notifications had been electronically delivered to James, his company's legal department, and the financial institutions holding our assets. The surgical strike had begun. At 11:42 a.m., my secure phone vibrated with a message from Mira. Jay received legal notifications, attempting to transfer funds from a joint business account. Too late. Already frozen. At 11:47 a.m., James called my regular phone. I let it go to voicemail, as would be normal during patient consultations. His message was tightly controlled but urgent. "Rebecca, call me immediately. There's been some kind of legal misunderstanding we need to address." I texted back, "In with the patient. What's wrong?" His response came instantly. "Nothing to worry about. Just some paperwork confusion? When can you talk?" "Surgery's scheduled until 4. What kind of confusion?" The delay before his next message suggested he was carefully considering his approach. "Just some mix-up with property records. Let's discuss it in person. I'll pick you up at 4. I showed the exchange to Dr. Liu, explaining that I needed to leave the hospital via an alternate exit at the end of my shift. His eyebrows raised, but he asked no questions, simply nodding. "I'll have Dr. Patel cover your final consultation." Side entrance by radiology will be quietest. At 3:45 p.m., I changed, out of my scrubs, left through the side entrance as suggested, and was met by Andrea's associate in an unmarked car. "James is waiting at the main entrance," he informed me. "Andrea wants you at the office immediately. The situation has escalated." As we drove away from the hospital, I received another call from James. Again, I let it go to voicemail. His message, this time, contained the first cracks in his composed facade. "Rebecca, where are you? I'm at the hospital. We need to talk about these ridiculous legal filings. Call me immediately." I had crossed the threshold. The pretense of normalcy was no longer necessary or possible. The carefully orchestrated plan had entered its active phase, and James had just discovered that the supportive, trusting wife he thought he knew had been replaced by a formidable adversary who had anticipated and countered his every move. Game had changed irrevocably. Now we would see how James responded to finding himself in a surgical crisis of his own making, one where I controlled the instruments and procedure. Andrea's office had transformed into a crisis command center. Computer screens displayed financial tracking data, court filing updates, and surveillance feeds from the monitoring devices in my home. The team had expanded to include 2 paralegals documenting incoming communications and a security specialist monitoring physical locations. "James has been calling every financial institution you have joint accounts with," Derek reported as I entered. "He's attempting to override the freeze orders with his power of attorney." "Which won't work," Andrea added, handing me a cup of coffee. "The emergency order specifically invalidates that document pending investigation of fraudulent use." I set down my hospital bag, transitioning mentally from surgeon to strategist. "What's our current status?" Valerie, the startup valuation specialist, pulled up a digital dashboard. "We've secured approximately $4.7 million in assets so far. Everything. In joint accounts, investment portfolios, and retirement funds. The property deed transfer has been flagged as fraudulent, effectively freezing any attempt to sell or further encumber the house." "What about his equity and health sink?" I asked. "More complicated," Valerie admitted. "We've filed notice with the company that his shares are subject to marital property claims, but pre-IPO equity has complex restrictions. The board has acknowledged receipt of our notice but hasn't responded substantively." My secure phone buzzed with a notification from Mira. "Jay returned home. Accessing home office computer. Attempting override of security systems." I nodded to the surveillance feeds displaying our home's interior. James was visible in his office, face tense with concentration as he worked at his computer. "He's trying to regain control of the digital environment," Mira explained, entering the conference room with her laptop. "I've established countermeasures, but he has administrator access to most systems. It's becoming a technical chess match." Andrea's expression remained calm but focused. "We need to discuss next steps. James knows you've discovered his financial manipulation, but he doesn't yet know about your awareness of Natalie Reynolds. That information provides significant leverage, especially with HealthSync's board. How do you recommend proceeding?" I asked. "2 options," Andrea said, writing on a legal pad. "First, we continue on the current track, secure financial assets, pursue fraudulent transfer claims, standard divorce proceedings. This is the measured approach." She turned the page. "Second, we accelerate and escalate. Inform HealthSync's board about the undisclosed relationship between their CEO and CMO, potentially forcing them to take action to protect the company's IPO prospects." I considered both approaches through the lens of surgical triage. The measured approach offered more control, but gave James time to develop countermeasures. The aggressive approach created immediate pressure, but introduced more variables. "What would the board's likely response be?" I asked Valerie, who had experience with startup governance. "At this stage, with the IPO filing imminent, they'd have no choice but to investigate. It's a material risk factor. undisclosed relationship. Between executives, potential misuse of company resources, conflict of interest in compensation decisions. At minimum, they'd place James on administrative leave during investigation. As I weighed these options, my regular phone buzzed with another call from James. This time, I answered, putting it on speaker for the team to hear. "Rebecca," he began, his voice controlled but tense. "Where are you? We need to talk about these ridiculous legal filings." "I'm safe," I replied simply, "and the filings aren't ridiculous. They're necessary given what I've discovered." A moment of silence followed. When he spoke again, his tone shifted to conciliatory. "Look, I understand you're upset about the property matter. That was just a temporary arrangement for tax purposes. I was going to explain everything at the meeting you missed. Was removing my name from our home without my knowledge also for tax purposes?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "What about the $3.2 million in marital assets you've transferred to entities I have no access to? Or the downtown condominium purchased through an LLC?" Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him recalculating. "These are complex financial structures to protect our assets before the IPO," he said finally. "Everything I've done is to secure our future. Let's meet and discuss this rationally. Just the two of us." Andrea shook her head emphatically. "I don't think that's possible right now, James. My attorney will contact yours to arrange formal discussions." His composure cracked. "Attorney? This is between us, Rebecca. We don't need lawyers turning a misunderstanding into a legal battle." "The fraudulent use of power of attorney isn't a misunderstanding," I replied. "It's a deliberate act with legal consequences." "This isn't like you," he said, his tone hardening. "Someone's clearly been putting ideas in your head. The Rebecca I know wouldn't resort to these tactics. The Rebecca he knew, the passive, supportive wife who enabled his ambitions while subordinating her own needs. The woman he had fundamentally misunderstood for 14 years. You removed my name from our home, James. The home my inheritance helped purchase. What did you expect me to do when I discovered that?" His response was immediate, revealing more than he likely intended. "How did you find out about the deed? Those records weren't accessible to you." A tactical error on his part, confirming his intent to hide the transfer. "Public records are public, James. Now, if you want to discuss this further, you'll need to do so through proper legal channels. My attorney will contact yours tomorrow." I ended the call before he could respond, looking to Andrea for assessment. "Well, handled," she nodded. "You maintained control, revealed enough to establish your knowledge of his actions without disclosing our full awareness or strategy." My secure phone buzzed with another update from Mira's monitoring systems. Making. Calls. First to Natalie Reynolds. 8 Mine conversation. Now speaking with Curtis Whitman, his attorney. Andrea made a decision. "We need to move to secure the house tonight. Based on his reaction, he may attempt to remove documents or assets." This accelerated our timeline, but made tactical sense. James now knew I had discovered his financial deception. His next logical step would be to secure or destroy potential evidence. "I'll need to retrieve personal items as well," I noted. "Medical credentials, family mementos, irreplaceable documents." "We'll arrange for a sheriff's deputy to accompany you," Andrea said. "Legal protection to prevent confrontation and ensure documented access." The next 2 hours were dedicated to preparing for this operation. Andrea secured an emergency order, allowing me access to the residence with law enforcement presence. Derek prepared a detailed inventory of financial documents to locate. Mira continued monitoring James's digital activities, reporting that he was systematically accessing and downloading files from our home network. At 7:45 p.m., I met Sheriff's Deputy Wilson in a pharmacy parking lot 3 blocks from our home. He was a veteran officer with experience in high-conflict divorce situations, calm, professional, and procedurally meticulous. "I'll announce our presence and explain the court order," he informed me, You'll have approximately 30 minutes to gather essential items. I'll remain present throughout to ensure compliance with the order and prevent confrontation. As we approached the house, I noted James's Tesla was still in the driveway. My pulse quickened slightly, the first physical manifestation of stress I'd experienced since discovering his betrayal. Deputy Wilson rang the doorbell, positioned slightly in front of me in a protective stance. When James opened the door, his expression shifted rapidly from expectation to shock to controlled anger. "Mr. Harrington," Deputy Wilson began formally, "I'm here to facilitate court-ordered access to the residence for Mrs. Harrington to retrieve essential personal items. I have the documentation here." James's eyes locked with mine as he accepted the papers. "This is unnecessary, Rebecca. You live here. You don't need a police escort to enter your own home." "Recent circumstances suggested otherwise," I replied evenly. We entered the foyer, Deputy Wilson maintaining position between us. The house felt suddenly foreign, a stage set where I'd performed the role of supportive wife rather than a genuine home. "I'll get my things and be gone within 30 minutes, I said, moving toward the stairs. "This is ridiculous," James called after me. "We need to talk, not escalate with legal maneuvers." I continued upstairs to our bedroom, formerly our bedroom, and began efficiently collecting essential items. Medical credentials, family photographs, the jewelry my mother had left me, personal documents I'd stored in my bedside table. In the bathroom, I gathered medications and toiletries, noting with clinical detachment that Natalie had left subtle traces of her presence. A distinctive perfume lingering in the air, a long blonde hair on the counter that wasn't mine. When I entered the home office, James was already there, hastily sorting through file cabinets. "Looking for something specific?" I asked, his movements still. "Just organizing some paperwork." "Financial documents related to the accounts you've been transferring assets from?" I suggested mildly. His jaw tightened. "Rebecca, this has gone far enough. Whatever you think you've discovered has a reasonable explanation. I've been protecting our assets, not hiding them. By removing my name from the house deed using a forged power of attorney?" "Not forged," he countered quickly. "You signed it. For medical decisions during international travel," I corrected. "Not for property transfers." I moved to the filing cabinet where I knew he kept household financial documents, methodically collecting copies of account statements, property records, and tax returns, all under Deputy Wilson's watchful eye. "Those are private business documents," James protested, taking a step forward. Deputy Wilson stepped between us. "Sir, the court order permits Mrs. Harrington to access and copy joint financial records. Please maintain appropriate distance." James retreated, visibly calculating his options. "This approach isn't like you, Rebecca. Lawyers, court orders, police escorts. This isn't how we solve problems." "How do we solve problems, James?" I asked, continuing to gather documents. "When you decided to remove my name from our home, did you consider discussing it with me first? When you transferred our joint investments into accounts I couldn't access, was that a mutual decision?" He switched tactics, his voice softening. "I know how this looks, but there's a bigger picture you're not seeing. The IPO is going to change everything. These measures were necessary to optimize our position before going public." "Our position?" I echoed. "Or yours and Natalie's?" His expression froze, confirming what the surveillance had revealed. I hadn't planned to disclose my knowledge of the affair yet, but his persistent attempts to manipulate me with false concern had triggered the revelation. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally managed. "The downtown condominium purchased through the LLC," I continued calmly, placing another file in my bag. 3 blocks from HealthSync's headquarters. Convenient location for the company's chief marketing officer, isn't it? Color drained from his face. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been investigating financial discrepancies," I corrected. "The affair with a company executive was an incidental discovery." Deputy Wilson maintained his professional demeanor despite the escalating revelations, checking his watch. 10 minutes remaining, Mrs. Harrington. I nodded, moving to collect. The last essential items, my medical reference books and research journals. James followed at a careful distance, his earlier confident demeanor replaced by visible calculation. Whatever you think you know about Natalie is a misunderstanding, he attempted. She's a company executive. We work closely together on the IPO positioning. In our bedroom? On our kitchen counter? I asked, meeting his gaze directly. That kind of positioning? His face hardened. You've been surveilling our home. That's illegal invasion of privacy. My home, I corrected. And the monitoring was installed after I discovered you'd fraudulently removed my name from the deed. My attorney assures me it's completely legal under the circumstances. As I finished gathering my belongings, James made one final attempt at manipulation. Rebecca, think about what you're doing. 14 years of marriage, everything we've built together. You're throwing it away over a misunderstanding about property records. I paused at the door, turning to face the man I'd supported through failed ventures and eventual success, who had repaid my loyalty with calculated betrayal. No, James, you threw it away when you decided I was a disposable component of your success story rather than an equal partner. Everything that follows is simply the consequence of that decision. Deputy Wilson escorted me to my car, ensuring James maintained appropriate distance. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror to see James in the doorway, phone already at his ear, undoubtedly calling Natalie or his attorney to develop countermeasures. Back at Andrea's office, I provided the collected documents to Derek for immediate analysis, while the team updated me on developments during my absence. HealthSync's board has acknowledged receipt of our formal complaint regarding the undisclosed relationship between James and Natalie, Andrea reported. They've scheduled an emergency meeting for 8 a.m. tomorrow. Their outside counsel has requested communications go through them rather than directly to James. That suggests they're taking this seriously, Valerie noted, potentially distancing themselves from James while they assess the situation. Derek emerged from his analysis of the new documents, expression vindicated. We've got it. Smoking gun evidence of fraudulent transfers. James was sloppy about documenting the power of attorney limitations. His own notes explicitly acknowledge the document didn't authorize property transfers. The final piece clicked into place as Mira added her update. James has been frantically attempting to access and delete cloud storage files since your confrontation. He doesn't realize we've already secured copies of everything. Andrea gathered us around the conference table, energy shifting from crisis response to strategic offensive. We've reached a critical inflection point. James knows we've discovered both the financial manipulation and the affair. HealthSync's board is now involved. The initial emergency orders are in place, preventing further asset movement. What happens tomorrow? I asked. James will likely make 2 parallel moves, Andrea predicted. Legally, his attorney will file counter motions attempting to lift the asset freeze and challenge the fraudulent transfer claims. Professionally, he'll try to convince HealthSync's board that the relationship with Natalie doesn't violate company policies or create conflicts of interest. Will either approach succeed? I asked. The legal challenge is unlikely to prevail given the evidence we've secured, Andrea assured me. The board's response is less predictable. Companies approaching IPO are exceptionally risk-averse. An undisclosed executive relationship creating potential governance issues represents significant risk. Mira's monitoring system alerted us to a new development. James is removing items from the house, loading his car with suitcases and boxes. The surveillance feed showed James carrying luggage to his Tesla. Not just overnight bags, but substantial suitcases suggesting extended absence. He's not coming back, I observed. He's relocating permanently. Most likely to the downtown condominium, Derek suggested. Abandoning the marital home strengthens your position in property division. We continued strategic planning until nearly midnight. preparing for various scenarios that might unfold the following day. Andrea arranged for me to stay at a secure hotel rather than Sophie's apartment, recognizing that James might now be actively attempting to locate me. As the team dispersed, Andrea remained behind to review final details. "How are you holding up?" she asked, the first person to inquire about my emotional state rather than tactical considerations. "Functioning efficiently," I replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, I'm experiencing an unusual emotional dichotomy. Professionally, detached about the strategic components while processing profound personal betrayal." Andrea nodded. "The surgical approach serves you well for now, but eventually you'll need to address the emotional impact." "After the operation is complete," I agreed. "In surgery, we maintain focus until the procedure is finished. Emotional processing comes later." "Just remember that unlike your patients, you're both the surgeon and the one being operated on," she observed insightfully. At the secure hotel, I finally allowed myself 30 minutes of unguarded emotional response. Not prolonged distress, but acknowledged grief for the partnership I had believed in and the future I had anticipated. The relationship had been dying for years, I now recognized, but James's betrayal had necessitated its sudden termination. I was preparing for bed when my secure phone alerted me to an email from an unexpected source. Charles Bennett, chairman of HealthSync's board of directors. The message was brief but consequential. "Mrs. Harrington, the board has reviewed the information provided by your legal representative regarding certain undisclosed relationships and financial activities. We would appreciate meeting with you personally tomorrow at 10 a.m. to discuss these matters further. Our outside counsel will be present. Please confirm if this is acceptable. Regards, Charles Bennett, Chairman, HealthSync Board of Directors." Forwarded the message to Andrea with a single question. "Strategic implications?" Her response came quickly. "Significant. Board reaching out directly rather than through James suggests serious concerns about his position. This meeting could fundamentally alter the power dynamics. We should accept but insist on legal representation." I confirmed the meeting with Bennett, specifying that my attorney would accompany me, then prepared comprehensive notes on my history with HealthSync, from the early days funding James's prototype with my retirement savings through years of supporting the company's growth with my steady income and healthcare expertise. Tomorrow would mark a decisive turning point. The board's involvement created a powerful new dimension in the conflict with James. His carefully constructed narrative, successful healthcare tech visionary supported by dedicated nurse wife, was unraveling precisely when he needed it most, for the IPO. As I finally lay down to sleep, I reflected on the remarkable acceleration of events. Just 5 days ago, I had been the trusting wife discovering her husband's betrayal. Now I was the strategic adversary who had secured millions in assets, documented fraudulent activities, exposed a damaging affair, and potentially jeopardized his corporate position. James had removed my name from our house using a forged document, believing I would be too trusting or intimidated to challenge him. He had fundamentally misjudged both my capabilities and my resolve. Tomorrow, he will begin to understand the full consequences of that miscalculation. 1 year later, I stood in the surgical observation gallery watching Dr. Liu complete a complex bypass procedure using the innovative cardiac stabilization technique our hospital had pioneered. As chief of surgical nursing, I now divided my time between administrative leadership, teaching, and selected complex cases. The promotion had come 6 months earlier, recognition of both my clinical expertise and the cardiac care initiative I'd championed with funds from my divorce settlement. My reflection appeared faintly in the observation window, composure intact, focus unwavering, but with subtle changes evident to those who knew me well. The past year had transformed me, not by breaking me as James might have expected, but by revealing strengths I hadn't fully recognized in myself. After the procedure, Concluded, I met with the surgical residents for debriefing, then returned to my office to review departmental budgets. A text from Sophie interrupted my work. Roof deck at 7, celebrating 1 year of freedom. I smiled at her characteristic directness. Sophie had been my steadfast ally throughout the divorce process, offering unwavering support without judgment. She'd even testified during the proceedings about James's frequent absences and my consistent dedication to our marriage. "We'll bring the good champagne," I replied. Before leaving the hospital, I checked my secure email one final time. A message from Andrea confirmed our scheduled meeting tomorrow to finalize the last financial transfer from HealthSync's recent acquisition. The final chapter in what had become one of the most consequential divorce cases in the state's recent history. As I drove to Sophie's apartment, I reflected on the cascade of events that had unfolded after my confrontation with James and the pivotal meeting with HealthSync's board of directors. That morning had begun with meticulous preparation. Andrea and I had arrived at HealthSync's headquarters precisely at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting. The company occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise, space leased with capital that included my retirement, savings from years earlier, though that fact had conveniently disappeared from James's company narrative. The receptionist had escorted us to the executive conference room where Charles Bennett, board chairman, waited with 3 other board members, and their outside counsel, conspicuously absent, James and Natalie. "Mrs. Harrington, thank you for coming," Bennett had begun formally. "The board takes the information you've provided extremely seriously. We've asked Mr. Harrington and Ms. Reynolds to remain off premises during this meeting to ensure open discussion." Andrea had opened her portfolio, revealing documents organized with surgical precision. "Before we begin, I should clarify that my client's priority is securing her rightful financial interests, not pursuing punitive measures against HealthSync as an entity." Bennett's relief had been visible but measured. "Appreciated, but we still need to understand exactly what happened here." For the next hour, I had methodically presented evidence of James's systematic financial deception, the fraudulent property transfer, and finally, the undisclosed relationship with Natalie that violated multiple company policies. I'd explained my history with the company, from funding the original prototype through years of supporting its growth with my stable income and healthcare expertise. To be clear, I'd concluded, I invested in HealthSync from the beginning, financially, professionally, and personally. James's attempt to exclude me from the company's success represents both personal betrayal and financial fraud. The board members had exchanged glances, their concern evident. Their outside counsel, a seasoned corporate attorney named Eleanor Walsh, had asked pointed questions about timeline, documentation, and potential exposure. After a brief private consultation, Bennett had made their position clear. The board has fiduciary responsibility to protect the company and its upcoming IPO. Mr. Harrington's actions, both the undisclosed relationship with another executive and the questionable financial maneuvers, create significant risk factors that must be addressed. "What specifically do you propose?" Andrea had asked. "Immediate administrative leave for both Mr. Harrington and Ms. Reynolds pending full investigation," Bennett had replied. "Additionally, we'd like to discuss equitable resolution of Mrs. Harrington's financial interest in the company, resolution that appropriately acknowledges her early contributions and prevents potentially damaging litigation during our IPO process." By meeting's end, the framework for settlement had emerged. I would receive 8% of James's equity stake in the company, valued at approximately $3.8 million pre-IPO, plus reinstatement of my name on the house deed and restoration of all joint accounts. In exchange, I would sign non-disclosure agreements regarding company operations and support an orderly leadership transition during the IPO process. James, of course, had not accepted these developments gracefully. Upon learning of the board's decision, he had attempted to enter the building, resulting in an embarrassing confrontation with security in the lobby. witnessed by several potential investors there for IPO discussions. The subsequent weeks had seen increasingly desperate countermoves from James. His attorney had filed emergency motions challenging the asset freeze and property deed restoration, all of which were systematically denied based on the evidence of fraudulent transfers. When legal avenues failed, James had attempted public pressure, contacting mutual acquaintances to present himself as the victim of an unreasonable vendetta. These efforts had collapsed when the forensic accounting report was finalized. Documenting approximately $3.2 million in marital assets, he had systematically transferred to entities under his sole control, funds that included portions of my inheritance, retirement savings, and joint investment returns. The judge's ruling had been unequivocal. The court finds clear evidence of deliberate financial deception and fraudulent use of power of attorney. Mr. Harrington's actions demonstrate premeditated intent to deprive his spouse of rightful marital assets. The final settlement had exceeded even Andrea's optimistic projections. Full restoration of my ownership interest in our home, recovery of all misappropriated marital assets plus interest, the 8% equity stake in Health Sync, and substantial compensation. For legal costs, the professional consequences for James had been equally significant. Health Sync's board, prioritizing the IPO timeline, had negotiated his resignation as CEO while allowing him to retain a reduced equity stake and ceremonial founder title with no operational authority. Natalie had resigned shortly thereafter, reportedly relocating to a competitor in another state. The IPO had proceeded 3 months later than originally scheduled, successful but at a considerably lower valuation than projected, $860 million rather than the anticipated $1.2 billion. My 8% of James's original equity, while diluted by the offering, had converted to approximately $5.4 million in liquid assets after lockup periods expired. More satisfying than the financial resolution had been the moment the property deed was officially restored, confirming my rightful ownership of the home my inheritance had helped purchase. I had promptly listed it for sale, unwilling to remain in a space tainted by betrayal. The real estate market's strength had yielded $1.2 million after mortgage satisfaction, funds I'd partially used to purchase a smaller but architecturally stunning mid-century modern home overlooking the city park. Sophie's rooftop deck offered a spectacular view of that same park, now transitioning to autumn colors in the evening light. She greeted me with her characteristic straightforward affection, a quick hug and immediate honesty. "You look better than you have in years," she observed, taking the champagne bottle. "Freedom suits you." We settled into comfortable chairs as the sun began to set, Sophie efficiently opening the champagne while I arranged the charcuterie board I'd brought. "How's the new cardiac center progressing?" she asked, pouring 2 glasses. "On schedule and under budget," I replied with justified pride. The Rebecca Chen Cardiac Care Initiative, named by the hospital board in recognition of my substantial donation, was developing innovative approaches to cardiac rehabilitation that combined advanced surgical techniques with comprehensive recovery protocols. "And the last of the financial transfers finalizes tomorrow?" Sophie confirmed. I nodded. HealthSync's acquisition by MedTech Global triggered the final conversion of my equity stake. Tomorrow's transfer concludes all financial connections. To James and the company. Sophie raised her glass. To complete liberation. We clinked glasses, the crystal tone ringing clear in the evening air. "Have you heard anything about where he ended up?" Sophie asked after a moment. "Andrea mentioned he's working with a startup in Seattle," I replied without particular interest. "Some kind of healthcare messaging platform. Minor position, not founder or CEO." "Quite a fall," Sophie observed. "From a nearly IPO CEO with $50 million equity to a minor player at a messaging startup. Consequences have a certain mathematical precision," I noted. "You can only leverage deception so far before reality reasserts itself." As darkness settled over the city, Conversation shifted to future plans. Sophie was considering a specialized trauma nursing position that would advance her career. I was exploring partnership with a cardiac research foundation that wanted to implement my rehabilitation protocols nationally. "You know what strikes me most?" Sophie said as we finished the champagne. "A year ago, you were defining yourself as James's supporting character, the wife who enabled his success. Now, you're fully centered in your own narrative." The observation resonated precisely. For 14 years, I had constructed my identity partly around supporting James's entrepreneurial journey, believing we were building something meaningful together. His betrayal had painfully but effectively severed that dependent connection, forcing me to recognize my own capabilities outside the context of our marriage. The irony, I reflected, is that James probably still doesn't understand what happened. In his narrative, I'm probably the vindictive wife who opportunistically took advantage of minor financial reshuffling to damage his career. Classic narcissist perspective, Sophie nodded, unable to recognize that his own actions triggered the consequences. Later that evening, returning to my new home, I found a package delivered by courier, Andrea's assistant, sending the final documents for tomorrow's meeting. As I reviewed the transfer paperwork, a small news item on my tablet caught my attention. HealthSync acquisition complete. Former founder not retained in restructuring. The article noted clinically that James Harrington, original founder now, holding ceremonial position, would not be continuing with MedTech Global following the acquisition. The technology he had developed, technology my retirement savings had helped fund in its earliest stages, had been fully integrated into MedTech's platform, rendering his continued involvement redundant. I felt no satisfaction or vindication from this development, merely clinical acknowledgement of natural consequences. James had built his success on manipulation and deception. When those foundations crumbled, the structure inevitably collapsed. My doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the security camera, I recognized Dr. Liu's wife, Emma, holding what appeared to be a plant. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said when I opened the door. "We just received these orchids from our daughter in Taiwan, and I immediately thought of your beautiful sunroom." I welcomed her in, touched by the thoughtful gesture. Emma had been another quiet supporter during the divorce, occasionally dropping off home-cooked meals during the most intense periods of legal proceedings. "It's a special variety," she explained, placing the elegant purple orchid on my kitchen counter. "In Chinese culture, it represents resilience, the ability to not just survive challenges but flower because of them." "It's perfect," I said sincerely, already envisioning it in the sunroom that had become my favorite space for morning meditation. After Emma departed, I carried the orchid to its new home among the other plants thriving in the sunlight. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, beauty emerging not despite adversity but through it, strength revealed rather than created by challenging circumstances. The following morning, I met Andrea at her office to finalize the last financial transfer from HealthSync's acquisition. The procedure was straightforward: signatures authenticated, transfers confirmed, receipt documented. With the final electronic confirmation, my financial connection to both James and the company he had founded was completely severed. "Congratulations," Andrea said, closing her portfolio. "Case officially concluded." Over the past year, our professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship. She'd been not just my legal representative, but strategic ally and occasional emotional support. "I have something for you," I said, retrieving a small box from my bag. "A token of appreciation for everything you've done." Inside was a platinum pen, elegantly engraved with her name and a simple message: "Precision changes outcomes." "It's what you taught me," I explained as she examined it. "Legal precision, strategic precision, emotional precision. These aren't just technical requirements but transformative approaches." Andrea smiled, understanding the deeper significance. "Most clients arrive seeking revenge or simple asset division. You approached this as a surgical procedure, methodical, precise, focused on optimal outcomes rather than punitive measures. Professional training, I acknowledged. In surgery, we learn that emotion clouds judgment. Precision requires clarity. We parted with plans to meet for dinner the following week. No longer attorney and client, but two professionals with mutual respect and shared experiences. Driving to the hospital afterward, I reflected on the symmetry of conclusion. Exactly 1 year after discovering James's betrayal, I had completed the necessary surgical excision of his presence from my life: financial, legal, residential, and emotional. The recovery process had already built significant new tissue: professional, advancement, financial security, meaningful friendships, and perhaps most importantly, reclaimed personal agency. I was no longer defining myself in relation to James's narrative, but authoring my own. As I parked at the hospital where my singular focus had always been healing others, I acknowledged that the past year had finally allowed me to apply those same skills to healing myself. The procedure had been complex and demanding, requiring specialized expertise and disciplined approach, but the outcome was unmistakably successful. James had removed my name from our house, believing I would be too trusting, too intimidated, or too invested in preserving appearances to challenge him. That miscalculation had cost him everything: his company leadership, professional reputation, financial security, and whatever future he had imagined with Natalie. I had not sought this outcome as vindictive punishment. Rather, his loss was the natural consequence of actions based on fundamental miscalculation. He had assessed me as a supporting character in his success story when I was, in fact, a skilled surgeon, perfectly capable of excising malignant presences with precision. The property deed bearing my restored name now resides in my safe deposit box alongside the final acquisition transfer confirmation. Physical reminders that precision, patience, and strategic thinking can transform even the most devastating betrayals into opportunities for unexpected growth. As I entered the hospital to begin another day of healing others, I carried the quiet certainty that comes from having successfully healed oneself, not just surviving betrayal, but emerging more whole, more capable, and more authentically centered than before the wound was inflicted. James had secretly removed my name from our house, but in doing so, he had inadvertently revealed my name was the only one that truly mattered in the story of my life. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.